So here we are at the start-finish line, the Brabham Straight at Brands Hatch Indy circuit. We're going to start from a little bit before the start-finish line, just to give you a view of the racing line as you're coming down the straight. Now, the previous corner is clearways. It's a fairly slow, accelerating right-hander, but we then keep the car over to the right-hand side, near to the pit wall here at Brands Hatch. So we're going to head up the start-finish straight now, and just up ahead we can see the start-finish line and the lights here. You'll receive all flags there, and obviously the lights at the beginning of a race if you are racing here at Brands Hatch. So at this point, a few hundred meters before the start-finish line, we're going to start bringing the car back over to the left-hand side. We have Paddock Hill Bend coming up, which is a fast right-hander. In most cars with 6 gears, say, it's a 4th or 5th gear corner. So it's a quick right-hander. You are coming uphill as you enter, and then you apex just as you're coming back down the hill. And there's a big dip at the bottom of Paddock Hill Bend, which you'll see in a few moments. So as we're coming up here to Paddock, you'll see that we're going uphill, and the braking for Paddock Hill Bend can be quite tricky because depending on what car you're in, you're either braking just before the crest of the hill or on it or slightly afterwards. So it's really difficult to get the braking right, especially if your car wants to be braking just on the crest of the hill, because obviously at this point the weight of the car, the mass of the car will be coming up as you go over the rise. So it can be quite tricky to brake for Paddock Hill. So first of all, we're going to take a look at some reference points. Now, at this point, it's probably still a little bit early to be getting on the brakes in most cars, but you do have as a reference the end of the barrier here marked with the orange boarding here on the right-hand side. Like I say, it's probably a little bit early, so we'll just go a bit deeper into the corner before we start talking again about braking points. As you can see here, we're not all the way over to the left-hand side of the circuit. We actually have a bit of a gap here to the left-hand side of the track. Now, the reason for this is just as you're coming into Paddock Hill, the circuit actually turns ever so slightly before it properly turns into the corner. And if you're running up against the white line on the left-hand side here, you'll actually need to turn while you're braking into Paddock. And obviously we want to brake with the car in a straight line as possible. So at this point, we're actually keeping the car 2, 3, 4 meters away from the left-hand white line so that we can actually brake in a straight line, and we'll end up on the outside of the track up here once we're finished with all of our braking. So we've got a few more braking references, obviously depending on your car. On the left-hand side here, we've got the three striped board marker. And on the right-hand side here, we have the end of the black wall on the right-hand side, which is the end of the pit lane. So depending on the car, obviously it depends where you're braking, but the important thing is to understand these references and know where they are, so that each lap you can gradually push yourself a little bit deeper into Paddock Hill Bend. So coming into Paddock Hill now, you'll notice that I'm just letting the car move over to the left slightly. You can see there's a slight change of tarmac here, and just in front of the right-hand side of the car, you can see the end of the pit lane line, which obviously when you're coming out the pitch, you can't come over the left-hand side of. But for here, it's just a good reference to know exactly where the car is positioned as you're coming into Paddock, because as you can see from this point, we can't see the apex of the corner. You can't see the curb on the inside. So very important to have this sixth sense of where the car is. But you get that from all these little reference points. For example, the patch of tarmac just in front of us, or the pit exit line on the right-hand side. So we're trying to keep the car in a straight line as we're coming in on the brakes. At this point, we'll gently be coming off the brake pedal, maybe trailing the brakes in just a little bit, but coming off them nice and smoothly. Again, from this point, you can't actually see the apex of the corner. So we're turning the car in nice and gently. We do have our eyes down towards the inside of the corner. We can begin to see a little bit of the curb on the right-hand side. And it's important that your vision is a long way ahead of yourself here, because we are going quite quickly. Even in this Radical SR1 that doesn't have so much downforce, and doesn't have slick tyres, we're still doing 154 kilometers an hour that you can see just here on the data logging in the bottom corner. So coming into the corner, into Paddock Hill, you can now see that there's a small curb on the right hand side here, but as we're coming into the apex, the curb actually gets quite a lot bigger. So big, in fact, that you don't want to be touching it as you're coming into the apex. Now you can see I've actually made a mistake on this lap. This Radical SR1 was early in its development, and it was a little bit tricky to drive. Well, that's my excuse anyway. So actually, I'll have missed the apex slightly here, and I've got a load of oversteer at the apex. So it's not the smoothest of entries, but anyway, you can see here that we're in towards the curbing on the right here, and you can see that it's actually two-stage. The first part of it is actually like this, where it's fairly steep, and then there's a plateau on the top. So this is an example of the curb. You don't want to touch it too much. It's so steep that it will unsettle the car and maybe just throw you a little bit off the optimum line. Now at this point, we want to be looking all the way down the hill, in the dip just down here, because that's about where we'll be making the exit point, where we'll be allowing the car to push out to the curb on the outside of the circuit. So that's where we need to be looking. At this point, we'll be blending back on the accelerator and letting the car push out. Now, obviously, we're going downhill here, and for any of you who have walked down this hill, it's a lot steeper than it actually looks. So you can let the car push out quite wide here, and then as you come into the dip, the compression, the car will begin to compress and actually give you a little bit more grip as you have more weight over the tyres because of the compression, and it will turn the car a little bit as you're coming into the dip. So we might look like we're quite wide here, but then as we come into this dip, the car will compress and it will actually turn the car just slightly. Now, I've come out reasonably well here onto the exit curve. Now, it is quite steep in this area here. So if you're in a single-seater, you probably don't want to take too much of this curb because it might touch the plank or so. It is quite steep at this point. But then it levels off. So in most cars, you can take all of the curb on the left-hand side here. Now, with the UK rules, remember that we can run outside tyres up to the edge of the curb. So we want to be using all the road on the outside, but we can't use any of the green concrete that's here. So all the way down here, we can't use any of this green concrete. Now it is just concrete, so if you do make a mistake and run a couple of feet wide, it's not the end of the world. But at Brands, if you're racing or even on test days, they're very strict with circuit limits, so try not to run beyond this curb too much. So by this point, we should be flat out on the accelerator. You can see I've used most of the curb there. And then we're bringing the car back onto the track. Now, the next corner is a 180-degree tight right-hander called Druids. We're coming uphill, so the braking can be quite tricky, and it's really important that you get a good braking point here because you can save quite a lot of time on the brakes. So coming up into the braking zone, you can see on the left-hand side here, again, we have a marshal's point, the end of the fence here, shown by the orange board. That's probably a bit early for most cars. We'll be braking somewhere between this point and into where the bridge, the Palmer Sport bridge here, goes across the circuit. So anywhere between these 2 points is generally where we'll be getting on the brakes, depending on the car, obviously, for Druids. So we want to keep the car over to the left-hand side and on the brakes, obviously, in a straight line. Now, we're still going uphill here, so it can be quite easy to lock a front because a lot of the car's weight is towards the rear of the car. So just be careful on the brakes here. Now, the right-hander here is quite similar to Luffield at Silverstone, somewhat tighter than Luffield at Silverstone, but we're actually in the corner for quite a long time. So at this point, you can see that my head is turning over to the right, and we're actually looking towards the apex. Now, there's a few options that we have here for the racing line. Traditionally, drivers come in around the outside and then bring the car into the apex, the kind of traditional racing line through a hairpin, which we have here. The quicker way here at Druids, depending on the car, is to V the corner off. So, for example, if we have the corner like this, which is what it's like, as you'll see in a few moments, rather than coming around the outside and then making a late apex and focusing on the exit, what tends to be quicker here at Druids is for us to come in a little bit earlier, cut off this section of track here, V the corner off, have this area now as the slowest point of the corner, try to get the car to rotate at this point, and then accelerate out of the corner, straight lining the exit. Obviously, that's not a perfect drawing there, but we'll explain that in a few moments as we're coming into the corner with the video footage. So you can see here, I'm kind of in the middle of the track as we go across this new tarmac on the right-hand side here. So again, that's another good visual reference to see that you're on the right racing line. And we're bringing the car in. My vision, my head is looking all the way to the inside in this area, somewhere around here. So we're always looking a long way ahead of ourselves. And I've not made the apex on the inside here, but I'm not all the way on the outside of the track. You can see the car got a little bit of oversteer. And at this point here, we'll be having the minimum speed in the corner. So we're trying to get the car to turn at this point. We're trying to get it to rotate. And if you've seen any of our tutorials on Driver 61 about weight transfer and rotation, then you'll understand that. If not, please take a look at the Drivers University series. So at this point now, I'm looking towards the outside of the circuit. I'm trying to understand whether the car's rotating properly or not as we come into the apex here. And it's important that you do get this rotation, get the car to turn as much as possible, because it can really reduce your lap time. So then we're letting the car turn. You can see here that the car begins to turn in to the apex. So I've just lifted off the throttle just a little bit here. So we've transferred some of the weight to the front of the car. The front's gripped. It's turned in to get the apex. And now we're doing really well to get the car out of the corner. You can see that I've got a nice opportunity for a nice straight exit coming out the corner here, which means that I'll be able to get on the accelerator nice and early and get out of Druids as quickly as possible. Again, we've got just some slight oversteer on the exit here. Now, you can use some of the curb on the left-hand side here. What you can't quite see, if I just go back a little bit on the video, and then go forwards again, I'm looking for the sensor on the left-hand side. Now, at Brands Hatch, they have various, there it is, they have various cameras around the circuit to show if you've run wide out of the corner. So here on the left-hand side, you can see there's a white sensor just beyond the curbing. Now, if you run wide, there's an automatic camera just a little bit down the road here. I don't quite know where it is, but if you run onto this sensor, it will take a picture of you, and the officials can give you the appropriate penalty. And they even run this in test days at Brands Hatch, so you really do need to be careful with your circuit limits at Brands Hatch. So now we're coming back down the hill towards Graham Hill Bend. Now this is very tricky, the approach. The trick to Graham Hill is, as you can see, the circuit turns as we're coming into Graham Hill, which is just down here. So this first part of the corner, as we come down the hill here, it's flat out in every car that I've ever driven at Brands Hatch. However, it makes the braking for Graham Hill a little bit tricky because the car's actually turning as you're getting on the brakes. So what it means is that you need to be very smooth when you first get on the brakes, so we transfer the weight to the outside front of the car as smoothly as possible. And then we come off the brakes as we go into Graham Hill. Now the trick is to do this all in one process, so that when you begin to turn through the corner, then you get on the brakes and the weight transfers to the outside. The car's still turning and braking, decelerating at this point. Then you come off the brakes and turn the car into Graham Hill. The idea is that the car only goes through one compression, one weight transfer. So the weight moves to the outside of the car, and then to the front, and then you come off the brakes and go into Graham Hill. If you're actually turning, braking, then straightening the car up again, and then turning into Graham Hill, it's one process too many, and putting the car through so much movement will actually cost you time. So we're just going to show you this as we're coming down the hill into Graham Hill. So we cross the white line here. We're somewhere in the middle of the road here as we come into Graham Hill. And now I'm beginning to get on the brakes. And the car's loaded up. We begin to turn into Graham Hill. Now on the outside here you can see there's an entry curb. Just be a little bit careful that you don't fall onto the grass here. It's very easy to do because our vision is across here at the apex of the corner, and we're only using our peripheral on the outside. So just be careful that you don't fall onto the grass. When you do drive onto the entry curb here, you can actually feel it through the steering wheel. So that's your warning sign that you're right at the limit of the track. And like I say, we've got our vision across to the inside of the corner. So you can see we're using most of the length of the entry curb on the right hand side. Then we're bringing the car in towards the apex here at Graham Hill. Now this curb is actually quite aggressive on the inside. So if you're in a sports prototype car or a single seater, you'll probably only be able to use half of the curb at most. If you use all of it, then you're really going to unsettle the car. Obviously in some saloon cars and GT cars, you might be able to get away with using a little bit more of the curb. It's important here as we're coming through Graham Hill that you get on the accelerator as soon as possible. Now, Brands Hatch Indy doesn't have many straights or many long straights, but this is the second longest. The start-finish straight is the longest section of the circuit. So it's really important that we get on the accelerator as soon as possible. So we've squared this corner off a little bit more than normal. We're concentrating on the exit. You can see here I've got a tad of oversteer in the Radical SR1, and we're going to use all of the curb on the outside here. So again, as I mentioned coming out of Druids, there's a sensor on in the grass just beyond the curb, which will take a photo of you if you run beyond the curbing. So you can see it's just here. So really important that you don't run beyond the curb on the exit of Graham Hill here. So we're focusing on getting a good exit. We should already be flat out long before the point at which we're at now. And it's just a gentle cruise down to the next corner of Surtees, which is a fast left into a fast right of Mclaren. Really exciting part of the circuit. It's almost flat or flat in a lot of cars that you might drive at Brands Hatch. So we're straight lining this straight because it does have a little bit of a kink in it. We're coming up to Surtees. We've got a few markers on our right hand side. We've got the 2 marker here, the braking board. We've got the end of the barrier marker here, and we've got another braking marker all the way down as we're coming into Surtees. Now, as I said, in most cars it's a gentle brake, a lift, or even flat out if you've got a little bit of aero on your race car. So again, already look at my vision. We're looking across towards the inside of the corner. Very important here because we're going quick, like at Paddock Hill, that we're looking a long way ahead of ourselves. So we're using all the road on the right-hand side. In most cars, this is generally will be where you're just gently touching the brake. And obviously, because we're going into a fast corner, we don't want to be stamping on the brake pedal. It's a nice, smooth braking with maybe not so much pressure, so we don't transfer too much weight to the front of the car, because that's often the problem here at Surtees. People overslow the car. They brake too much as they're coming in. They'll transfer too much weight to the front of the car, which means that the rear of the car is light, which means that they have oversteer as they're coming through Surtees, which isn't what you want when you're going very quick into a left-hand corner. So vision across at the inside of the circuit, all smooth movements here, smooth inputs on the steering wheel, very gentle on the accelerator, whether you're coming off the accelerator or when we get to the apex getting back on. And again here at Surtees, we want to be using probably half of the curb. It depends on your car, because even the first half of this curb can unsettle some cars. Now the apex, if you look down at the curbing here, the apex is in this little kink of the curb here, this part here. Let me just remove the pen here. But here, there's a bigger kink in the curb. Now, if you walk around the circuit, you'll see there's actually a drain there, and that's exactly where the apex is. So you can see here this kink, this extra little kink here in the curbing. That's where we're going to be making the apex. So I've made it here. We're back on the accelerator, and again, we're looking a long way forwards. Just to mention, I did say that you should only use half the curb. You can see here that this second half of the curb that runs down here is actually really aggressive. No one really uses this curb. It's too big for most cars. Maybe some older saloon cars, you could get away with it, but it's something that you're going to have to test. Definitely in single-seaters and prototype cars and modern GT cars, you're not going to be using that aggressive part of the curbing on the left. So we're going to be heading forwards now into Mclaren. We're letting the car push wide. Now, the right-hander isn't so much of a corner, really. We're using this next section as a braking zone for coming into clearways. It's quite technical, it's quite difficult, but it's important here because it's very tricky. You can see the circuit comes around to the right. Well, it actually comes around to the right, continues around, tightens up a little bit, and then we're back onto the start-finish straight around here. So this braking zone is actually very technical and very tricky. So what we're doing here, we're trying to keep the car in a straight line. We're beginning to get on the brakes. I've taken a bit of curb there. You don't generally want to do that because we're going to be unsettling the car. Now what we're doing here is we're allowing the car to push towards the outside here. We'll have our minimum speed here before we then come into clearways and get back on the accelerator. So it's very technical, very difficult when you're braking like this because we might have a little bit of steering angle here. You can see here I'm trying to keep the car as straight as possible with as little steering angle in it so we can decelerate, get on the brakes as much as we can. We're letting the car push towards the outside but not all the way around the outside. You can see there's a bit of a gap here. And I'm actually quite wide on this lap. It depends on the car as to how wide you come in or how much you veer off this next corner. However, if you do go too far over to the left, it's very difficult to get the car to come back in into clearways. You just can't make the car turn enough. So we're generally not using all of the road on the right-hand side. You can see now that my head's turned and we're looking towards the inside here. We can just catch the first glimpse of the curb at clearways. We're still decelerating slightly. We just come off the brakes here and we'll just let the car roll into clearways. We're somewhere in the middle of the road at this point. You can see on the right hand side there's a smaller curb. Well, the curb gets bigger as you go further into this next corner, which is clearways. And where the curb becomes larger and wider, this is where we want to be making the apex at clearways. So as you can see here, there's a small curb on the right. You can now see that the bigger curb is appearing, and that's where we want to make the apex. You can just touch the curb here if you want to. If you do look quite closely, though, it's not a perfectly flat curb. This part here is flat, but then the next part on the inside is actually quite rough, so you don't want to take too much of that second stage of the inside curb. Now, as you can see here, we're coming up over a crest. So as you come here, because you're getting back on the accelerator, the rear of the car is squatting down. It's sitting down at the rear, which makes the front of the car light. Add to that the fact that we're coming over a crest here, and the front of the car will go light anyway. We typically get quite a lot of understeer in this phase of the corner at clearways at Brands Hatch. So it's something drivers will always complain about because we can't get the setup right for clearways, and it's such an important corner here at Brands Hatch because it leads onto the longest straight. It's very important that we get a good exit coming out of clearways, but it's something that we always struggle with to get a car well set up for clearways, because if you get it set up well here, then when we go through the other corners here at Brands Hatch, we're not going to have the perfect setup. So it's really something that you have to just deal with. It's something that you can try and change your technique slightly just to get the car to rotate at this point. So then you just get it into a little bit of oversteer and try and drive that through the exit of clearways. Now we're just looking a long way ahead of ourselves here. And the exit of clearways is actually quite tricky because, as you can see, the circuit continues to turn all the way around here as we're coming into the start-finish straight proper. But obviously from this point and before, we can be flat out in a lot of cars. So it's really important that we do get on that accelerator pedal as soon as we possibly can. So we're letting the car push out. I've got a tad of oversteer here at this point. And this is the general area for the exit point. It can be difficult because you've got all these inconsistencies. It depends how you come into clearways, because obviously that braking area is quite tricky. And then as you come up over the crest, the idea is not to get too much understeer. If you get too much understeer and you're running out of track on the outside and you're having to lift at this point, you will just destroy your lap time. So give yourself a few inches, half a foot or so, on the outside so that you make sure that you can keep the accelerator flat all the way through this section, and we get good drive onto the start-finish straight. So from this point on, once the car's settled down here, we're still just bringing it in, but we're not using all the grip now of the car, so we can drive the car towards the inside. So now we're coming through Clark Curve, and you can see a marshal's post all the way down here, just this section. If I go a little bit closer, this is what we're looking for as we come onto the start-finish straight. This is where we'll make the inside of the corner as we're coming down here. Now, at this point, Brands Hatch Indy can be, there's lots going on. You're not out of a corner for very long. So this is the point that you want to check your mirrors. If there's anyone quicker behind you, or if you're on a track day, pull over to the right-hand side, or whichever side that track day company tell you to allow people past. Check your temperatures, check your gauges, make sure everything's good with the car, because you don't have much opportunity here at Brands Hatch to check anything. So this is the point that you want to be doing that. So we're looking towards that marshal's post. We're gently bringing the car to the inside to have the shortest line as we're coming onto the start-finish straight. There's the marshal's post. And now, as you saw at the beginning of this video, we keep the car over to the right-hand side. Obviously, this is where you would see your pit board along here if you're in a race. And, well, that's the end of our circuit guide for Brands Hatch Indy. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please share with your social media.